Welcome to Cafe Tales, where every story is a new mystery. Waiting to be solved, grab a coffee stay. Curious, and share the thrill with fellow mystery lovers. Let's get started. Hercule Poirot and the Mystery of the Chapter 1. Death at the Symphony Conductors. Battle Chapter 1. Death at the Symphony. I had been in London for just over a fortnight when Pooh suggested we attend the symphony my old friend Hadine recent months developed. What he termed an appreciation for the finer harmonies, though I suspected his interest had more to do with the London Symphony's new conductor than any sudden passion for Beethoven. Mon ami Poirot said, as we settled into our excellent seats, third row center procured through some connection I didn't inquire about tonight. We shall witness the great Maestro Vanelli. They say his Fifth Symphony is without equal in all of Europe. I thought it was Beethoven's symphony, I remarked. Adjusting my program, Pooh's mustache twitched in that particular way that indicated I had said something that amused him. The composition, yes, it is Beethoven's, but the interpretation, the soul of the performance that belongs to the conductor and Vanelli. He possesses what the English called the iron fist in the velvet glove. The murmur of the crowd diminished as the orchestra members took their places. I observed the first violinist, a striking woman with severe features, softened only slightly by her formal black attire, arrange her music with precise movements. Poirot followed my gaze. "Madame, Elena Rossi," he murmured. "They say she once had aspirations beyond the orchestra pit." Before I could inquire further, the audience erupted in applause as a tall, imperious figure stole onto the stage. Maestro Antonio Vanelli acknowledged the reception, with the meest inclination of his silver-haired head, his expression suggesting he found the adulation both expected and somewhat tedious. "He carries himself like a general reviewing troops," I whispered to Poirot. "Or perhaps a king addressing subjects." "Revins wanting," Poirot replied softly. "Observe, Hastings, how not one of the musicians meets his eye. Directly there is fear there, and something else, resentment. Perhaps the light dimmed behind Vanelli." A younger man with keen features handed him a slender baton with ceremonial deference. Veli accepted it without acknowledgement, and the assistant whom he program identified as Richard Bennett, associate conductor, retreated to the wings. The first notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony filled Royal Albert, even to my untrained ear. There was something magnificent in the way Vincelli commanded the orchestra. Each movement of his baton seemed to physically draw the music from the instruments, as though he were pulling invisible strings. He is masterful, is he not? Murmured, his eyes fixed on the conductor. I nodded, noticing a distinguished gentleman in the front row watching the performance with unusual intensity. He sat forward in his seat, his gaze never leaving Vincelli's. "Do you know who that is?" I asked. "Dr. Julian Mercer," said Poirot, "the orchestra's physician. A sensible precaution given the passionate nature of artistic temperaments." The first movement concluded to enthusiastic applause as the second began. I noticed a well-dressed woman, in a box seat to our right, watching Vanelli through opera glasses with particular attention. She barely seemed to blink. "Lady Margaret Harrington," Poirot explained, following my gaze again with that uncanny perception of his a generous patroness of the arts. "They say her generosity extends ends beyond financial support, where Vanelli is concerned." Though he does not reciprocate her enthusiasm, the symphony progressed, and I found myself drawn into the powerful crescendos and delicate passages that flowed from the stage. Vel's conducting became more animated. As the music built toward what I assumed was the climax of the third movement, his gestures grew broader, more demanding, his small frame somehow expanding to fill the stage it was during. A particularly dramatic flourish. That it happened, Vanelli raised the baton high, his face contorted with the emotion of the piece, then brought it down in a sweeping arc and suddenly froze. The baton remained clutched in his hand, but something had changed in his stance. The orchestra continued for several bars before the musicians, closest to him, sensed something. Miss one by one, instruments F, and fell silent, though some in the rear continued playing, unaware of the unfolding drama. Vincel's Body swayed slightly, his free hand moving to his chest in a curious fluttering motion. The baton slipped from his fingers, clattering to the stage with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the now silent hall. Then, with a terrible grace maestro, Antonio Vanelli collapsed for a moment, a bizarre suspended moment. No one moved, perhaps like myself. They believed this to be some theatrical element of the performance. It was Pooh who broke the spell, rising to his feet with unusual haste. A doctor. Is there a doctor present? He called, though his eyes were fixed not on the fallen conductor, but on the baton that lay beside him from the front row. Dr. Mercer was already vaulting onto the stage with remarkable agility for a man of his years. The audience erupted in confused murmurs as he knelt beside Vanelli, loosening the conductor's collar and feeling for a pulse call. An ambulance, Dr. Mercer shouted, beginning chest compressions. With practiced efficiency backstage, a woman's voice cried out a sharp sound of distress that cut through the growing commotion. A young woman with Vel's distinctive profile pushed past the gathering musicians, falling to her knees opposite Dr. Mercer. "Father," she cried, reaching for Vincel's hand. Moiselle." "Please, doctor," Merca said firmly. "Give me room to work." Poirot was already making his way toward the stage, and I followed close behind as we reached the steps at the side. A harried-looking man in evening clothes intercepted us. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but you can't, Charles." Whitcomb. Poirot addressed him by name, though I was certain they had never met. "I am Hercule Poirot. It would be most helpful if you would clear the hall of spectators while preserving the scene." Nest SP, the orchestra manager, blinked in surprise, then nodded of, "Course, Miss Poirot, your reputation precedes you as Whitcomb," moved to address the increasingly restive audience. Poirot stepped onto the stage with the natural authority that always amazed me. He approached the fallen conductor, but Medano moved to interfere. With Dr. Mercer's efforts instead, he bent down, and with a quick movement that I doubt anyone else noticed, retrieved the fallen baton, slipping it into his pocket. "Pooh," I whispered, alarmed. "What are you doing, ensuring that evidence is preserved, mon ami?" "Poirot," he replied quietly. "This was no natural death. Observe the blue tinge to his lips, the fixed pupils, and most telling the way, he gripped the baton at the last, not as a conductor but as a man in sudden terrible pain." I looked again at Vanelli. The maestro's face in death had lost its imperious cast, and now seemed merely old and somewhat bewildered. Dr. Mercer sat back on his heels, shaking his head. "He's gone," he announced, closing Vincel's staring eyes with gentle fingers. "I suspect a massive coronary event," perhaps, said Poirot in a tone that suggested he thought nothing of the kind. A commotion at the stage door heralded the arrival of Inspector of Scotland Yard, his familiar, somewhat bulldog-likey features set in an expression of harried efficiency. "Pooh," he exclaimed, spotting my friend immediately. "I might have known you'd be mixed up in this. Good evening." "Chief Inspector Pooh," Ripley replied calmly. "It seems our paths cross yet again over a matter most unfortunate." Jap's gaze moved to the body of the conductor, then back to Poirot. "Natural causes. Is it heart attack?" During the excitement that said Poirot, patting his pocket where the baton lay hidden. "Is what we must determine. But I would suggest, my friend, that the concert hall be sealed and Alice and be questioned before departing. This may be a performance none of us was expecting to attend. The perfect murder in plain sight, as began issuing orders to the constables who had accompanied him. I saw Richard Bennett watching from the wings, his face a mask of professional concern. But there was something else in his expression, a calculation perhaps that made me wonder. Poirot, following my gaze, nodded slightly. "Observe everyone." "Hastings," he murmured, "the killer still stands among us, and the performance, I fear, is far from over." Chapter 2. Initial Investigation. Inspector moved with practiced efficiency, ordering the constables to secure the exits of Royal Albert Hall, while instructing the flustered ushers to guide the audience back to their seats. The murmurs. Confusion swelled around us like an impromptu and discordant symphony. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced his voice carrying through the hall, "I must ask for your patience. There has been an unfortunate incident, and we shall need to take some brief statements before anyone departs from my position near the stage. I observed the reactions of those closest to where Maestro Vanelli had fallen. The orchestra members remained in their seats, instruments forgotten in their laps, exchanging whispers and glances of bewilderment. Richard Bennett had emerged fully from the wings, and now stood with a curious stillness, his gaze fixed on the spot where Vincel's body had lain before it was discreetly covered and removed to an antechamber. Poirot, meanwhile, had drawn Inspector aside. I joined them in time to hear my friend speaking in that precise manner he adopted when imparting critical information. "Chief Inspector, I insist that particular attention be paid to the maestro's baton," Pooh said, producing the slender object from his pocket. "You observe the craftsmanship. Now, this is not a common implement." Took the baton with a frown. "Seems ordinary enough to me." Poirot: "Fine wood, certainly, but look more closely at the grip." Poirot insisted, his index finger indicating the area where Vincel's hand would have clasped the baton. "You see the almost imperceptible discoloration, and here," he pointed to a minuscule irregularity in the polished surface, "is what I believe to be a mechanism of most ingenious design." Squinted, bringing the baton closer to his face. "I'll be blowed. There is something there, like a tiny pin." "Prick precisely," said Poirot. "I suggest this baton be secured immediately and examined by your forensic experts with the utmost care. It may well be our murder weapon." "Murder weapon," I exclaimed, perhaps too loudly, earning a reproving glance from Poirot. "Discretion." "Hastings," he murmured. "But yes, I believe Miovelli was murdered." Most deliberately and with exquisite timing, nodded grimly, wrapping the baton carefully in his handkerchief. "I'll have it sent to the laboratory straight away. In the meantime, let's begin questioning the key figures." He glanced toward the stage, starting with those closest to the victim. During his final moments, Pooh's eyes gleamed with that particular light I had come to recognize as his detecting faculties engaging fully. An excellent suggestion. Perhaps we might use the conductor's private room for these interviews. It would afford us privacy and possibly additional insights. Backstage was a warren of narrow corridors and small rooms. We whirled to Vell's private chamber by a nervous young constable who had clearly never before set foot in such rarefied artistic surroundings. The room itself was appointed with underrated elegance, a comfortable set, a writing desk with precisely arranged score sheets, and a full-length mirror. Most notable was a glass-fronted cabinet mounted on the wall, its velvet interior designed to hold what I presumed were Vincel's collection of batons. "The case appears intact," observed Poirot, examining the cabinet without touching it. "No sign of forced entry." And yet he paused, his head tilting slightly, in that characteristic pose of his when something captured his attention. "Curious, the spacing suggests an item is missing." Charles Whitcomb, the orchestra manager, was our first interviewee, a tall man with thinning hair and the perpetually harried expression of someone juggling too many responsibilities. He entered the room with obvious reluctance. "A terrible business, gentlemen," he said, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. Despite the room being quite cool, Maestro Chell was a towering figure in the musical world. Irreplaceable, quite irreplaceable. And yet, Pooh remarked mildly, "I understand you will need to replace him rather quickly. The season is underway, is it not?" Wham's eyes darted to Puo, then away. "Yes, well, Richard Bennett will step in temporarily. He's been Vincel's understudy for nearly 2 years, capable enough, though lacking the maestro unique interpretation. This cabinet," Puo indicated the glass case it holds Vell's batons. "Yes." Whitcomb confirmed he was most particular about them. Had them specially crafted by an artisan in Vienna, would use nothing else, and who had access to this cabinet. Whitcomb shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, Vanelli himself, of course, and I have a mastery key to all rooms, as does Mrs. Abney. Our wardrobe mistress, though I can't imagine she would have any reason to enter the maestro's private room. The cabinet itself appears to be locked." Observed Vanelli kept the key on his person at all times, Whitcomb replied. "He was particular about his possessions, one might say, paranoid." Is suggested. Whitcomb's lips thinned. "One might say justified in his C. A Maestro Vanelli had many admirers who would not hesitate to claim a souvenir, and some detractors who might he trailed off, seeming to realize the implication of his words. What Mr. Wickham prompted, who might wish to sabotage him in some small way. Whitcomb finished lamely. The musical world is more competitive than outsiders realize. I understand Vincelli was not universally belle within the orchestra. Poirot marked his tone conversational at this. Whitcomb gave a short, humorous laugh. An understatement, ma Poirot. Vincelli was brilliant, a genius even, but he was also ruthless. Just last week, he dismissed 3 musicians, veterans with decades of experience, because they failed to meet his exacting standards during rehearsal, called them musical incompetence in front of everyone. He shook his head unnecessarily, cruel, and yet you defended his decision. Quo inquired. My position required it. Whitcomb replied stiffly. The London Symphony must maintain the highest standards, even at the cost of human dignity. I asked, unable to contain myself. Whitcomb merely shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes about the compromises his position entailed. After Whitcomb was dismissed, Dr. Mercer joined us, still in his evening clothes, but now with the sleeves rolled up. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a medical professional accustomed to emergencies. I've completed my preliminary examination, he informed us without preamble. At first glance, it appears to be cardiac arrest, but there are certain anomalies that trouble me, such as inquired the rapidity of onset. For one, Vanelli displayed no signs of distress until the very moment of collapse, and there's a curious puncture mark on his right palm. Minute easily overlooked, but definitely present. Poirot nodded, as though this confirmed a theory already forming in his mind. Would this be consistent with a toxic substance delivered via a sharp projection on the Baton? Dr. M's eyebrows rose. Absolutely. A fast-acting neurotoxin introduced directly into the bloodstream would produce exactly the symptoms Vanelli exhibited, but such a method would require considerable knowledge, both medical and technical, and opportunity, added Poirot. Tell me, doctor, from your position in the front row, did you observe anything unusual before the maestro's collapse? Something flickered across Dr. M's face so quickly. Might have imagined it. Nothing. Beyond Vell's usual intensity, he was particularly animated during that performance. You attend all performances, Keat? I asked. Most, Mercer replied. It's part of my role as orchestra physician. The physical demands on musicians are considerable, particularly during extended performances, and your relation to Vincer was purely professional, Poirot inquired. Dr. Mc's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Purely professional, he confirmed after the doctor departed. Interviewed Elena Rossi, the first violinist. She entered with a regal bearing that seemed at odds with her position in the orchestra, her dark eyes assessing each of us in turn. Madame Rossi. Poirot, began my condolences on the loss of your conductor. Thank you, she replied, her English perfect, but tinged with an Italian accent, though I suspect many will mourn the maestro's genius more sincerely than his person. You were not fond of him? Asked bluntly. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Fond? No, Inspector Vincelli did not inspire fondness, respect, fear, admiration, envy. These were his currency. Fondness he considered beneath his station. You understand, you knew him in Italy before your time with the London Symphony. Poirot said. Madame Rosie's expression cooled. Ancient history. M. Poirot. We were colleagues in Milan briefly. More than colleagues, perhaps, Poirot suggested delicately. Her eyes flashed. Is my personal history relevant to his death from heart failure? If it were merely heart failure, perhaps not, Poirot conceded. But when murder is suspected, all connections become significant. The word murder hung in the air like a discordant note. Madame Rossi's composure slipped for just an instant before she recovered. Murder, she repeated softly. I see, then. Yes, Vanelli and I were involved many years ago, a mistake I paid for dearly when I ended the relationship. He saw to it that my hopes for a solo career were thoroughly crushed. She straightened her shoulders, but that was 20 years ago. I've made my peace with my place in the orchestra. As she rose to leave, Poseidon. Final question. The Baton Vanelli used tonight, was it his usual one? Madame Rossi paused at the door. I couldn't say with certainty. He had had several that appeared identical to my eye. But Vanelli himself would have known immediately if someone had substituted a different one. His sensitivity to such details was extraordinary. After she departed, Pooh turned to us, his expression thoughtful. Our victim, he said, becomes more interesting with each conversation, a man of genius who cultivated enmity as assiduously as cultivated his art. The list of those with motive grows, but the method, theme thud, restricts our field considerably. How so, I ask? The murder weapon is elegant, Hastings precise, required technical skill, intimate knowledge of Vell's habits, and perfect timing. Our killer is no opportunist, but an artist in their own right. Pooh's eyes gleamed. And like all our artists, they have left their signature on their work. We need only learn to read it correctly. Chapter 3. The Complicated Maestro. Our interviews continued well into the evening. The grand hall had emptied of its audience, leaving behind an eerie silence, punctuated only by the occasional footsteps of constables securing evidence. Poirot insisted on maintaining the sequence of interviews without pause, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. Despite the late hour, the impressions are freshest. Now, mon ami, he explained when I suggested a break, and in matters of murder, time is the greatest enemy of truth. Richard Bennett was next to enter Vincell's private room. The assistant conductor had changed from his performance attire into a more casual jacket. Though he remained impeccably groomed, he carried himself with the confident posture of a man accustomed to command. Yet there was something deferential in his manner as he greeted Poirot Muir. Poirot, your reputation precedes you, Bennett said, extending his hand. Though I confess, I'm puzzled by your involvement. Surely Maestro Vell's tragic heart attack doesn't warrant the attention of Europe's greatest detective. The circumstances of death often reveal themselves only gradually. Miss Bennett. Poirot replied, his expression giving nothing away. I am merely assisting, Inspector, in ensuring all proper procedures are followed. Bennett nodded, though I noticed his gaze drift momentarily to the glass cabinet with its missing baton. You were Vincell's assistant for how long? Inquired, notebook in hand. Nearly 2 years, Bennett replied, though assistant is perhaps misleading. Associate conductor is my official title. I conduct certain performances when Maestro Vanelli is indisposed or engaged elsewhere, and I lead sectional rehearsals, and the relationship between you was Pooh left the question. Deliberately open-ended, Bennett's smile, waist-tight professional. Vanelli was not one for personal relationships within the orchestra. He believed familiarity bred mediocrity, yet you handed him his baton tonight. I observed that seems a rather personal service for an associate conductor. At tradition, Captain Hastings, nothing more. Bennett explained the ceremonial presentation of the baton is customary in many orchestras. It signifies the transfer of authority from the institution to the conductor. And the baton you presented tonight, Poirot interjected, was it selected by you or by my Vanelli himself? A flicker of something concern perhaps crossed Bennett's face. By Vanelli. Of course, he kept his batons locked in that cabinet and selected one before each performance based on criteria known only to himself. Different pieces apparently required different batons. Though I never discerned any pattern to his choices, you had no access to this cabinet. Asked none. Bennett confirmed, firmly. Vanelli guarded his batons jealously. They were crafted specially for him by an artisan in Vienna, perfectly balanced for his grip and conducting style. I understand you are now the interim conductor, Pooh remarked casually. By default, yes, Bennett acknowledged, until the board appoints a permanent replacement, a position you yourself might covet. Suggested bluntly. Bennett's expression hardened slightly. Every conductor aspires to lead a prestigious orchestra, Inspector. I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. But I had hoped to earn such a position through merit, not tragic circumstance. After Bennett departed, Poirot paced the small room, his hands clasped behind his back, his lips moving silently, as though carrying on a conversation with himself. It was a habit I had observed many times when his little gray cells were particularly active. What do you make of him? I asked, a man of ambition. Certainly, Poirot replied. But whether that ambition extends to murder? He shrugged eloquently. Let us reserve judgment until we have spoken with all our suspects. Lady Margaret Harrington arrived with the imperious air of one unaccustomed to waiting. Despite the late hour, she was immaculately dressed. Her jewelry subtle, but unmistakably valuable, she carried herself with the confidence of wealth and position. Yet I detected a certain fragility beneath her composed exterior. "I really don't see why I should be detained like a common criminal," she announced as she entered Mayo and Cheliwas. "A dear friend, this has been a most distressing evening. We apologize for the inconvenience, lady." Hercule Poirot said, his manner instantly more deferential. "Your insights may prove invaluable, particularly given your close association with the orchestra. I am merely a patroness." She demurred, though her expression softened at Pooh's flattery. "The arts must be supported, especially in these difficult times. Your generosity is well known." Poirot agreed. "I understand you recently presented Maestro Vinelli with a gift, an antique baton." Lady Harrington's perfectly manicured hand went to the strand of pearls at her throat. "Yes, a small token of appreciation. Once belonged to Gustave Mara. A collector's piece. I thought Antonio would appreciate." "And did he?" inquired. A shadow passed across her features. He septased it, though not with the enthusiasm I had hoped for. "Antonio could be difficult in matters of gratitude. There was a public disagreement between you recently." "You believe?" Poirot asked delicately. Lady Harrington's cheeks colored. "Slightly, a minor artistic difference, nothing more. I suggested the orchestra might include more Elgar in their repertoire for patriotic sentiment. You understand, Antonio felt such considerations had no place in programming decisions. And did you threaten to withdraw your financial support?" Pressed, her eyes flashed. "Certainly not. Well, perhaps I intimated that my patronage might be directed to more appreciative cultural institutions, but that was merely the heat of the moment. Antonio and I had a complex relationship, but I valued his genius above all. This antique baton," Pooh continued. "Might we see it? Perhaps it was the one Maestro Vinelli chose for tonight's performance. I doubt that very much." Lady Harrington replied. "Antonio called it charming, but impractical, and said he would keep it as a display piece only. He was quite particular about his performing instruments." After Lady Harrington's departure, our final interview of the evening was with Sophia Vinelli. The conductor's daughter entered. With visible reluctance, her resemblance to her father unmistakable in her sharp features and intense gaze. She appeared exhausted, grief etching lines around her ease that made her look older than her 35 years. Mademoiselle Vanelli Poirot began gently. "Please accept my condolences on your loss." "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, despite her obvious fatigue. "Though I suspect you're less interested in my grief than in my Albi." Miss Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Your directness is appreciated. I understand your relationship with your father was complex." A bitter smile crossed her face. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it. My father abandoned my mother and me when I was 12 years old. He considered family a distraction from his art. We reconnected only recently after my mother's death last year. Yet you were seen arguing with him before tonight's performance," noted. Sophia's gaze was unflinching. "Yes, he had refused to fulfill the financial promises he made to my mother years ago. Promises that would have made her final years more comfortable." She paused, collecting herself. "It was about money, Inspector, not murder." "You are a chemical engineer, I believe?" Pooh inquired. "I am," she confirmed. "I specialize in industrial applications of organic compounds and expertise that would include knowledge of various toxins." I suggested. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you implying my father was poisoned, and that I had something to do with it?" "We are merely establishing facts," Mademoiselle Poirot said soothingly. "Your father's baton appears to have been modified to deliver a toxic substance. Such modification would require both technical skill and access to certain chemicals, along with opportunity and motive." Sophia added flatly, "Yes, I understand how it looks. Poirot. I have the knowledge, the apparent motive, and I was backstage before the performance." She leaned forward slightly. "But if I had wanted to kill my father, I would hardly have chosen such a public and theatrical method. I am a scientist, not a dramatist. When our interviews concluded, and Sophia had departed, Pooh stood before the glass cabinet, studying the empty space where a baton should have been. Our victim grows more complex with each conversation, does he not? Hastings? He murmured, a man of undeniable genius who cultivated animosity as diligently as he cultivated his art. The murderer required 3 things: technical ability, access, and intimate knowledge of Vel's habits. Our field of suspects is not narrowing but expanding. What's our next step? Asked, stifling a yawn. We must examine the full orchestra, Pooh declared. Tomorrow. I wish to observe a rehearsal under Muir Bennett's direction. The dynamics of the orchestra may reveal much that remains hidden, and his eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. I would very much like to locate the missing baton from this cabinet, for I suspect, mon ami, that when we find it, we shall be much closer. Chapter 4. Family Disharmony Killer. Chapter 4. Family Disharmony. The following morning found us at Vel's London apartment, a spacious flat in Mayfair that reflected its owner austere tastes and singular focus, unlike the cluttered homes of collectors or the comfortable arrangements of domestic life. Vel's residence was a temple to music alone. The sitting room contains little furniture, save for a grand piano and a single armchair positioned before a music stand. The walls were lined with shelves of scores and recordings meticulously arranged by composer and date. Observe Hastings, Puo murmured, as we waited for Inspector to join us. No photographs, no mementos. The absence speaks as loudly as any presence might. Not a man who values personal connections, I agreed, taking in the sterile perfection of the room. And yet Puo continued, his finger tracing the spines of leather-bound musical scores. A man of passion, but passion directed entirely toward his art tone. Might say he did not live with music. He lived. For it alone the door opened, to admit, accompanied by Sophia Vanelli. The maestro's daughter looked even more warm than she had the previous evening, her face pale beneath her dark hair. She nodded keenly to Poirot and myself, the building manager. Let us in, she explained, her voice flat. I'm apparently listed as my father's next of kin despite our estrangement. Most considerate of you to accompany us, Pooh said. A daughter's insight may prove invaluable. A bitter smile touched her lips. Hardly. I've been in this apartment exactly twice before today, both in the last month. My father was not one for family visits yet. You sought to reconnect with him recently, I asked. Sophia moved to the piano, running her fingers lightly over the polished surface without pressing the keys. After my mother died last year, I found myself adrift to despite everything. He was my only remaining family. I thought perhaps we might. She shook her head. It was foolish. Sentimentality, he rebuffed. Your attempts at reconciliation, Puo inquired gently. Not entirely. He agreed to meet occasionally. Though always on his terms, our conversations inevitably turned to what he called practical matters. Primarily my mother's estate, who had been examining a desk in the corner, looked up sharply. Estate, I understood. Your mother died with limited means. She did. Sophia confirmed, but she maintained until her death that my father had promised her financial support that never materialized. She believed he had set aside funds in a trust. Her expression hardened. He claimed no such arrangement existed, that my mother had fabricated these promises to say, face your disagreement before the concert concerned these matters. Poirot tasked. Sophia nodded. I had discovered some old letters suggesting there might indeed have been a formal arrangement. I confronted him with them, but he dismissed me, said the past was irrelevant, and that my mother had always been prone to convenient fictions. Her voice caught slightly. It was our final conversation, as Sophia moved about the apartment, pointing out the few areas she was familiar with. Pooh's attention was drawn to a small study adjacent to the main room. Unlike the austere sitting room, this space showed signs of regular use. Papers on the desk, a half-empty cup of what appeared to be cold coffee, and most significantly a small open case lined with velvet. The Baton case, Puo murmured, examining it without touching. Empty. You observe, should it not be? I asked. According to Mr. Whitcomb, Vincelli kept a collection of specially crafted batons. This case appears designed to hold one, yet it is empty. And the cabinet at Royal Albert Hall showed a missing baton as well. His eyes gleamed. Our maestro was meticulous about his instruments. Hastings' such absences are most suggestive while questioned. Sophia further about her father's acquaintances and habits. Pooh continued his methodical examination of the study. He paid particular attention to the desk, where scattered papers reveal correspondence in multiple languages. Vanelli maintained an extensive international network. He observed invitations to conduct in Vienna, Berlin, New York. A man at the peak of his profession, which makes his murder all the more baffling. I replied, if professional jealousy was the motive, surely there were more direct rivals than those in his own orchestra. But proximity provides opportunity, mon ami, and in matters of passion, be it love, hatred, or revenge, proximity can be the decisive factor. Poirot carefully shifted a stack of papers, revealing an envelope with a Vines postmark. His expression sharpened as he examined the contents. Most interesting, he murmured, returning the letter to its place. With meticulous care, our exploration was interrupted by a telephone call from Royal Albert Hall. After a brief conversation turned to us with a grim expression, the laboratory results are in. He announced Vanelli was indeed poisoned, a synthetic neurotoxin delivered through a puncture wound in his palm. The baton contained a spring-loaded mechanism that could be triggered by applying pressure at a specific point. He glanced at his notebook. The report states that such a device would require significant engineering knowledge to construct and knowledge of chemistry to select the appropriate toxin. Pooh added, or murderer is both technically skilled and scientifically informed. Sophia, who'd been standing in the doorway, visibly paled. You're suggesting I'm responsible? Because of my engineering background, we are exploring all possibilities, mademoiselle. Poirot replied diplomatically. Then explore this, she said. With sudden intensity, my father made enemies everywhere he went. His pursuit of perfection was relentless and cruel. Ask about Vienna, Poirot. Ask about what happened there 5 years ago. What happened? In Vienna, demanded. Sophia's law was hollow. I don't know the details, only that a promising young musician challenged my father's interpretation during a rehearsal. He was publicly humiliated, his career destroyed. There were rumors she trailed off. What sort of rumors? It pressed that the young man took his own life shortly afterward, that my father was unmoved, calling it natural selection in the artistic sphere. She shook her head. My father's dedication to music exceeded his humanity, Inspector. Perhaps that is motive enough. As we prepared to leave the apartment, Poirot paused once more before the empty baton case, his expression thoughtful. The missing baton, he mused. 2 empty spaces where there should be instruments, the original and the replacement. Perhaps we must locate them both, for I suspect that in these absences lies the key to our mystery. Chapter 5. Patronage and Passion. That afternoon found us once again at Royal Albert Hall, where Richard Bennett had scheduled an emergency rehearsal with the orchestra. The vast auditorium felt oddly intimate, but with rows of empty seats facing the stage where musicians were arranging their music stands and tuning their instruments. The atmosphere was subdued, yet charged with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to vibrate alongside the strings being tested. Pooh and I positioned ourselves discreetly in the third row, close enough to observe the interactions among the orchestra members, but not so near as to intrude upon their grief and professional duties. Pooh's gaze was particularly fixed on Richard Bennett, who stood conferring with Charles Whitcomb at the edge of the stage. Observe Hastings, Poirot murmured. Already, he adopts the posture of authority. Note how the musicians glance toward him, some with curiosity, others with assessment. A new hierarchy establishes itself with remarkable speed. Necessity, I replied. They perform again tomorrow evening, don't they? Indeed. The show must continue, as they say. But in this continuity may lie revelation. Our attention was drawn to the entrance of Lady Margaret Harrington, who swept down the center. Deal with the purposeful stride of someone who considered the space partially her own. She nodded curtly to us before approaching Bennet and Whitcomb. Though we could not hear their conversation, her animated gestures suggested strong opinions were being expressed. The patroness asserts her influence. Poirot observed most interesting as Lady Harrington turned to leave. Puo rose smoothly to intercept her lady. Harrington, a moment of your time, if I might impose her expression. Suggested imposition was precisely what she considered it. But good breeding prevailed briefly. Miss Puo, I have a luncheon engagement. Of course, I merely wish to inquire about the antique baton you presented to my store in Shelley. Might I see it? It could be relevant to our investigation. A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, or concern crossed her aristocratic features. I'm afraid that's impossible. The baton is no longer in my possession, and Vanelli never displayed it in his office or apartment. Most curious, Puo replied, a valuable historical artifact, yet it seems to have vanished. Do you recall precisely when you presented it to him last Tuesday evening? After the Brahms concert, her gloved hand toyed with her pearl necklace. Antonio was less appreciative than I had hoped. He called it an interesting museum piece but unsuitable for serious conducting, and this was before or after your disagreement regarding the orchestra's repertoire. Her lips thinned after, though. I hardly see how that matters in murder investigations. Lady Harrington, timing often illuminates motive, Poirot said gently. I understand Maestro Vanelli could be ruthlessly dismissive of those who contradicted his artistic vision. Antonio was an artist of uncompromising standards, she replied stiffly, if lesser. Minds found him difficult, that was their limitation. Not his yet. His dismissal of your gift must have been wounding, particularly following a public disagreement. A flash of genuine emotion broke through her composed exterior. Do you imagine I would commit murder over wounded pride? Miss Poirot. I valued Antonio's genius even when I found his manner insufferable without his talent. What meaning would my patronage have after Lady Harrington departed? The rehearsal began. In earnest, Bennet conducted. With precise, contained gestures, a saint contrast to Vincel's flamboyant style. The orchestra responded tentatively at first, but gradually found its rhythm under the new leadership. What do you make of Bennet? Asked quietly, a competent technician. Puo replied, his eyes never leaving the stage, though perhaps lacking the spark of true inspiration. But observe how carefully he treads, neither mimicking Vanelli, nor imposing too dramatically different an interpretation. A man who understands the politics of succession. As the rehearsal progressed, I noticed Elena Rossi watching Bennet. With an inscrutable expression, when they paused between movements, she leaned forward to make a suggestion that Bennet appeared to welcome, nodding with what seemed genuine appreciation. The dynamic shift. Poirot murmured Madame Rossi would never have offered such input to Vanelli. After the rehearsal concluded, we encountered Dr. Mercer in the corridor leading backstage. He carried his medical bag and explained he was checking on several musicians who had been particularly distressed by Vel's death. A considerate gesture. Pooh remarked, You take your duties as orchestra physician most seriously. These musicians are under my care. Mira replied, Psychological well-being affects physical performance. Vanelli understood that even if he chose to ignore it in his pursuit of perfection. Did you ever counsel him about his methods? A shadow crossed M's face once. He informed me that coddling mediocrity was not in his job description nor in mine. He hesitated, then added, My brother was a violinist, you know, quite talented. He encountered Vanelli in Vienna some years ago. Sophia Vanelli mentioned an incident in Vienna. I said a young musician who challenged the maestro. CA's expression hardened. My brother made the mistake of questioning Vel's tempo during a master class. Vanelli destroyed him publicly, called his understanding primitive, his technique amateurish. Within a year, my brother could not secure auditions with any significant orchestra. A harsh consequence for a professional disagreement, Pooh observed. Vincelli didn't engage in disagreements. Miss Poirot, he delivered judgments. Mirca's knuckles whitened around the handle of his bag. My brother took his own life. 3 years ago, Vanelli, when informed, reportedly said it was regrettable but inevitable. When talent fails to recognize its limitations, after Mera continued on, His way Poirot stood silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Another connection to Vienna. He mused the circles. Tight and Hastings we made our way backstage, where we encountered a small efficient woman with iron gray hair arranging costumes in a wardrobe room. She introduced herself as Mrs. Abney, the wardrobe mistress. Did you happen to see anyone enter Maestro Vell's private room before the performance yesterday? Poirot inquired. Mrs. Abney continued her work as she considered the question. Several people, I should think. Mr. Bennet naturally. Madame Rossi consulted him about a passage in the score, and there was someone else, just a glimpse as I passed. I couldn't say how with certainty, but you saw someone pressed a figure in the doorway. She confirmed. I assumed it was authorized. Everyone is so careful around the maestro's private space. She paused, realizing her slip into present tense, and corrected herself. We're careful, I should say, as we left the wardrobe area. Pooh's pace slowed, his brow furrowed in that particular way that told me his little gray cells were arranging and rearranging the facts. Vienna, he murmured, a missing baton. A gifted baton, a doctored baton, the timing of a musical passage. His eyes brightened suddenly. Hastings, we must speak with George Harrison immediately, the stage manager. I asked, surprised. Booties hardly figured in our inquiries thus far. Precisely why his insights may prove illuminating, Poirot replied cryptically. For in this performance, my friend, I believe there were more than musical cues being followed. There was a schedule of death, precisely. Time to the beat of Beethoven himself. Chapter 6. Medical Matters. George Harrison, the stage manager, proved surprisingly difficult to locate when we finally discovered him examining lighting equipment in the upper gallery. His manner was distracted and somewhat defensive. I've already spoken with the constables, he informed us, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with ink-stained fingers. I'm afraid I saw nothing unusual before the performance. Maestro Vinelli was particular about his pre-concert routine. No interruptions, no deviations. It is precisely this routine that interests me. Poirot replied, the exact sequence of events from Vincel's arrival until his collapse. You, as stage manager, would observe these with professional attention. No, Harrison hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. True enough. It's my job to coordinate everything down to the second. Then perhaps you might describe the final minutes before Maestro Vinelli took the stage. Harrison closed his eyes briefly as though consulting an internal schedule. Vinelli arrived precisely 1 hour before performance, as always. He spent 40 minutes alone in his room. Preparation time, he called it at 20 minutes before curtain. Bennett would deliver the evening score for final review at 10 minutes. Bennett would return to escort him to the wings at 3 minutes. The orchestra would be ready at 2 minutes. House lights would dim at 1 minute. Bennett would present the battle. Then on my signal, Vinelli would walk onto the stage. And these timings were consistent, never varied. Pooh inquired. Never. Vinelli considered precise timing an extension of musical discipline. Any deviation would result in, Harrison winced, well, unpleasantness. And on the night in question was this sequence observed exactly. Harrison frowned, considering. Yes, though. He paused, though Pooh prompted. The presentation of the baton seemed slightly different. Usually Bennett would present it ceremonially. Holding it across both palms, that night he handed it over more directly. I thought nothing of it at the time. After leaving Harrison, we made our way to the small laboratory room where Scotland Yard's forensic experts had set up temporary headquarters. The baton that had delivered the fatal poison lay on an examination table, now partially disassembled to reveal its deadly mechanism. Ingenious and diabolical, remarked the forensic specialist, a thin man with perpetually surprised eyebrows. The hollow chamber within the handle contained a spring-loaded needle coated with the toxin. When sufficient pressure was applied to this specific point of the grip, as would naturally occur during an emphatic conducting gesture, the needle would deploy momentarily into the palm, then retract. The victim would feel nothing more than a slight prick. Asked precisely in the excitement of conducting, it might register as nothing more than a splinter or minor irritation, but the toxin would enter the bloodstream immediately, and the nature of this toxin, Poirot inquired a synthetic neurotoxin derived from compounds found in certain reptile venoms but chemically modified to increase potency. Extremely fast acting, death would occur within 60 to 90 seconds of administration. Would the preparation of such a substance require specialized knowledge? I asked, indeed. The specialist confirmed. Advanced training in organic chemistry at minimum and access to laboratory equipment, such as one might find in a chemical engineering facility. Poirot suggested precisely that as we departed, Jap's expression was, "Grim, this doesn't look good for Sophia." Vanelli, the technical expertise, the access to chemicals, the motive of financial grievance and family estrangement. Do not rush to conclusions. My friend Pooh cautioned, the evidence suggests someone with a particular combination of skills, musical knowledge, technical ability, chemical expertise, and intimate familiarity with Vell's habits. We must consider who possesses the complete set. Our next interview was with Dr. Mercer in his small medical office, adjacent to the orchestra's rehearsal rooms. The space was clinically organized with medical texts lining one wall and a glass cabinet containing various pharmaceuticals. Along another, the autopsy results confirm what I suspected, Mercer informed us. Studying the report had brought a fast-acting neurotoxin that would have caused almost immediate cardiorespiratory failure. Vincelli would have experienced, perhaps, a moment of awareness before collapse. You recognize the symptoms, immediately, Pooh observed. I've had occasion to study various toxins. Mara replied, part of my medical training included toxicology, and your front row seat would have given you a perfect view of precisely when Vanelli might grip the Dr. Baton with sufficient force. I noted Mirka's expression cooled. Are you suggesting I orchestrated this murder, Captain Hastings, that I somehow sabotaged his baton, then sat in the audience to watch my handiwork unfold? We are exploring all possibilities stated bluntly, then explore this. Mercer replied, his composure cracking slightly. I was sitting beside Lady Harrington. At no point did I leave my seat before Vincel's collapse, and while I detested the man for what he did to my brother, I am a physician. I took an oath to preserve life, not to end it. Your brother's situation in Vienna, Poirot said gently. It was not uncommon, I believe. Maestro Vanelli had a history of destroying careers. Merck's laugh was hollow. Destroying careers. He destroyed lives. Miss Poirot, my brother was merely one among many. There was another, a promising conductor, named Bennett. Not our Richard Bennett, but his older brother Thomas Bennett had a brother. I asked, startled. Yes, Thomas Bennett challenged Vincel's interpretation during a master class in Vienna. 5 years ago, Velli used his considerable influence to ensure Thomas never conducted a major orchestra again. Richard never speaks of him, but I know the history in musical circles. These stories travel after leaving Mirka's office. Pooh was uncharacteristically silent as we walked through the corridor. His brow was furrowed in that particular way that indicated intense mental activity. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts at such moments when the little gray cells were arranging and rearranging the facts into a coherent pattern. We made our way through the grand building, passing musicians who spoke in hushed tones about the evening's memorial concert. Poirot paused briefly to observe a notice board where a copy of the previous night's program was displayed, his eyes lingering on the listing of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The pattern was indeed emerging. Vienna. The destroyed careers, the suicides, are now a brother's potential revenge. All the elements required for this murder were coming into alignment, the musical knowledge to predict the exact moment when Vanelli would grip the baton with maximum force, the access to create or switch, the batons, the technical skill to design the mechanism, and a motive far deeper than mere professional advancement. As we approached the archive room, where the orchestral scores were kept, Pooh's expression changed to one of quiet determination. Within those musical notations might lie the final confirmation of our murderer's identity, the precise moment in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, when death had been scheduled to the beat of a musical masterpiece in the convergence of art and vengeance. Poiret sought the truth, and I could see in his eyes that he believed we were drawing ever closer to it. Chapter 7. The second Baton. The next morning dawned gray and misty. A fitting backdrop to our somber investigation, Poirot had arranged for us to return to Vancel's apartment before the memorial concert scheduled for that evening this time. We were accompanied by Miss Lemel, Poirot's secretary, whose efficiency in matters of research was unparalleled. "I have compiled the information you requested, Mr. Poirot," she announced as our taxi pulled up to the Mayfair address from her impeccably organized attaché case. She produced a folder containing newspaper clippings and printouts, all references to Maestro Well's performances in Vienna over the past 7 years, with particular attention to any controversies or incidents. Excellent, Miss Lemon. Your thoroughness, as always, is beyond reproach. The building manager admitted us once again to Vin's apartment in the clear morning light. The austere elegance of the space seemed even more pronounced, a life dedicated to art at the expense of human connection. Weil began a more thorough search of the study quo, and I examined the main living area. Miss Lemon arranged her materials on the piano, which served as the only suitable surface for paperwork. "The empty Baton case continues to intrigue me," Poirot murmured, examining the velvet-lined container once more. "If the baton used in the murder was a replica, specially crafted to contain the deadly mechanism, then where is the original, perhaps disposed of by the killer?" I suggested possibly. But why the original baton would not carry evidence of wrongdoing? Pooh's fingers traced the contours of the empty case thoughtfully. "No, Hastings. I believe there's more significance to this missing instrument. Emerged from the study holding a small leather-bound book. Appears to be some sort of journal," he said, "mostly musical notations and critiques of performances. But there are some personal entries as well." Poirot took the journal with interest. Leafing through the pages filled with Well's sharp, angular handwriting, he paused. At an entry dating 5 years earlier, Vienna, March 1920. He read aloud another tedious master class. "With mediocre talents, one particularly presumptuous young man, T.B., had the audacity to question my interpretation of the third movement I have insured. He will not find engagement with any orchestra of significance. Such arrogance must be excised from the profession." "T.B.," I murmured. "Thomas Bennett, indeed." Poirot confirmed and observed the date precisely when Dr. Mercer indicated the incident occurred. As Poirot continued to examine the journal, Miss Lemon approached with a newspaper clipping. "You may find this relevant, Mr. Poirot, from the Vienna Musical Chronicle dated June 1922. It reports the suicide of Thomas Bennett, describing him as a once promising conductor whose career had stalled following a controversial dispute with the renowned Maestro Vinelli." Poirot nodded gravely. "The pattern solidifies. And what of communications to Vinelli regarding this matter?" "There is this," Miss Lemon replied, producing a letter written on heavy stationer. "It arrived 3 months ago according to the postmark." The letter was brief, written in a precise hand. "Maestro Vinelli, the debt of Vienna remain. Unpaid music demands justice, as you have so often proclaimed. What you have taken cannot be restored, but balance will be achieved." The signature, Poirot observed, is not a name, but a musical notation. "A single eth note could be," anyone remarked. "Not much to go on." "On the contrary," Poirot replied, "it tells us a great deal. The writer is someone who thinks in musical terms, someone who feels Vinelli owes a debt related to Vienna, someone who speaks of justice and balance." Heist's expression grew thoughtful, and someone who knew Vinelli would understand precisely what this referred to. Our search of the apartment continued methodically in Well's bedroom. Spartan as the rest of the flat, we discovered a locked drawer in the bedside table. With the building manager's permission, forced it open to reveal a small collection of personal items. A faded photograph of a much younger Vinelli, with a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sophia, a few letters tied with ribbon, and most significantly, a newspaper clipping about the appointment of Richard Bennett as associate conductor of the London Symphony. Curious that he would keep this, I observed. Perhaps he saw in Richard Bennett what had destroyed in Thomas Poirot, suggested a form of atonement, or perhaps merely professional interest, as we prepared to leave. A telephone call from the forensic laboratory brought news. The analysis of the fatal baton had revealed fingerprints most belonging to Vinelli himself, but with clear impressions from Richard Bennett as well. To be expected, noted Bennett presented the baton to Yes, Pooh agreed. But the question remains, when was the substitution made? For there must have been two batons, the genuine one from Vincel's collection and the deadly replica. Our investigation led us next to Lady Harrington's Belgravia residence, where Poirot hoped to learn more about the antique baton she had gifted to Vanelli. We were admitted to an elegantly appointed drawing room, where musical memorabilia adorned the walls, signed photographs of famous composers and conductors, including a prominently displayed portrait of Vincelli. Lady Harrington received us with cool politeness. I've already told you all. I know about the battle, Mr. Poirot. It was an antique piece once owned by Gustave Marais. Purchased it at auction, specifically for Antonio. And when you presented it to him, Bureau inquired. He was less than enthusiastic. He examined it briefly, thanked me with obvious reluctance, and placed it in his coat pocket. I never saw it again. Did he mention what he intended to do with it? He said something about his collection. She replied. I assumed he meant to display it at his apartment or office, but you did not see it in either location number. Perhaps he disposed of it. Antonio could be. She hesitated, ungracious when displeased. As we took our leave, Poirot paused to examine a photograph on a side table. Lady Harrington with the orchestra at a gala event in the image. Vincelli stood at a distance from her, while Richard Bennet was positioned nearby, smiling politely for the camera. Lady Harrington. Poirot inquired, your impression of Mr. Bennet? Her eyebrows raised slightly. Richard, he's charming, competent, always appropriate, unlike Antonio, who could be so unnecessarily harsh. Richard understands the social aspects of musical leadership that Antonio disdained. Back in the taxi, Pooh sat in thoughtful silence, his fingers pressed together in his characteristic pose of contemplation. The pieces were coming together. Vienna, the Bennet brothers, the missing batons, the precise timing required for the murder. We must examine the score. Hastings. He finally said the exact score used in that fatal performance, for I believe our murderer left his signature not only in the method but in the precise moment chosen for Vel's death. The music itself will tell us when the fatal gesture was predetermined to occur. The memorial con was scheduled for 8. Before then, we had an appointment with the orchestral librarian to examine Vel's annotated score of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the music that had accompanied a conductor to his meticulously planned death. Chapter 8. The Rehearsal Revelation. Revelation. The orchestral library at Royal Albert Hall occupied a small climate-controlled room lined with shelves of round scores and individual parts. Here, amid the musty aroma of paper and binding glue, we met Miss Evan Porter, the orchestral librarian, a slender woman with wire-rimmed spectacles and the careful hands of someone accustomed to handling precious documents. Maestro Vel's personal score, she said, placing a large bound volume on the table before us. He was most particular about his annotations. No one else was permitted to mark the score. Not even Mr. Bennet. Poirot examined the cover, and this is the exact score used during the final performance. Yes, sir. I retrieved it from the podium myself, after. She faltered. After the incident. Most helpful. Pooh murmured, carefully opening the volume. Now, would you say these markings are characteristic of Maestro Vanelli? Usual annotations. Miss Porter adjusted her spectacles and peered at the pages. Oh yes. See. These dynamic markings in red and these tempo adjustments in blue. Quite his standard practice. Poirot turned the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the musical notations, with surprising familiarity for one who, to my knowledge, had limited musical training. Paused at the third movement where Vanelli had made particularly extensive markings. Most interesting. He said these annotations in the third movement, they indicate a significant change in tempo and dynamics. Do they not indeed? Miss Porter confirmed. The maestro was known for his dramatic interpretation of the third movement he would build. To an unusually powerful climax at this passage, she pointed to a section heavily annotated, in various colors, and this moment would require a particularly emphatic conducting gesture. Poirot inquired. Oh yes, Maestro Vanelli would practically leap at this point, bringing the baton down with tremendous force to drive the crescendo. Her expression softened with memory. It was his signature moment. Audiences always responded with particular enthusiasm. One final question, if I may: did anyone examine this score shortly before the performance, perhaps to review the maestro's interpretation? Miss Porter's brow furrowed in concentration. Mr. Bennet collected for final review, as was customary, but there was someone else. She hesitated. I believe I saw Madame Rossi. Consulting it briefly that afternoon, she mentioned a question about a violin passage after thanking the librarian. We returned to the main hall where preparations for the evening's memorial concert were underway. The stage had been draped in black, a large photograph of Vanelli positioned where he would have stood. Richard Bennet was conferring with Charles Wickham near the piano. Both men engrossed in what appeared to be a program change. Shall we confront Bennet? Now asked quietly. Not yet, Pooh cautioned. I require one final confirmation. And here comes the very person who might provide it. Elena Rossi approached, music folder tucked under her arm. She acknowledged us with a slight nod. Madame Rossi, Pooh began. Might I impose upon your musical expertise the passage in the third movement of Bain's Fifth? The one Maestro Velli interpreted with such distinctive emphasis. Could you identify the precise moment in the score? If she found the request odd, she gave no indication, taking the score Poirot offered. She turned immediately to the relevant page here. She said, pointing to a measure marked with Vell's bold reed annotations, this fortissimo passage is where he would make his most dramatic gesture. He insisted it represented Fate's most powerful statement in the entire symphony, and at this exact moment, his grip on the baton would be at its most forceful. Undoubtedly, he would grip as though his life depended on it. Her expression faltered as she realized the unfortunate irony of her words. Thank you, Madame. Most illuminating. After Madame Rossi departed, Quo carefully marked the page in question. The moment of death was not random. Hastings. It was precisely calculated to coincide with this dramatic passage, a moment when Vanelli would inevitably grip the baton with maximum force, triggering the hidden mechanism. Only a musician would know that I observed precisely, and not merely any musician, but one intimately familiar with Vell's interpretation of this specific work. We made our way backstage, where Mrs. Abney was arranging mourning bands for the orchestra members to wear during the evening's performance. Upon seeing Pooh, she approached with an air of hesitant concern. Miss Poirot, I've been thinking about what you asked about seeing someone in Maestro Vell's room before the performance. I wasn't certain then, but I've had time to reflect. Yes, madam, it was Mr. Bennet I saw, but there was something odd about his manner. Normally he's so proper around the maestro things, but this time he seemed to be examining something very closely when he noticed me passing it quickly, pocketed whatever it was most interesting, and this was when, precisely, perhaps 40 minutes before the performance during the maestro's preparation time, when he should have been alone. Thank you, madame. Your observation may prove most significant. As Mrs. Abney returned to her duties, Pooh led us to a quiet corner where we could speak without being overheard. His expression had taken on that particular intensity that signaled his little gray cells had arranged the final pieces of the puzzle. We must search Bennet's belongings, he said quietly. I believe we will find either the original Baton from Vincelli's collection or the antique presented by Lady Herring. Perhaps both. On what grounds? Asked. In need more than musical notations to obtain such authorization. Then perhaps this will suffice, Poirot replied, removing from his pocket the threatening letter Miss Lemon had discovered. Observe the signature, a single eighth note. Now compare it to these. From his other pocket he produced a notated score sheet. These are Bennet's own annotations on a piece he conducted last month. Observe how he marks certain passages with the same distinctive eighth note symbol. Examined both documents carefully. Similar, certainly, but would that stand up in court combined with opportunity, motive, technical ability? And this, Poirot indicated the marked passage in Beethoven's Fifth. I believe we have sufficient cause to proceed with Japp's authorization. Discreet search of Bennet's office and dressing room was conducted while he rehearsed with the orchestra. In a locked drawer office desk wrapped in velvet lay two batons, one matching the description of the antique Marabe baton, the other clearly from Vincel's personal collection. As the rehearsal concluded, and Bennett stepped from the podium, he found Poirot and myself waiting. Viewing's his expression betrayed only my curiosity, until produced the two Batons. The blood drained from Bennett's face, his composure fracturing for the first time since we had met him in that moment, looking at his stricken expression. I knew that Poirot had solved the mystery of the conductor's baton. The orchestra members filed past, some casting curious glances at the tableau we formed. The memorial concert would proceed in a few hours, but it would be led by another conductor for Richard. Bennett, the music had finally stopped. The memorial concert proceeded with a subdued dignity, conducted by a hastily summoned maestro from another orchestra. The audience, unaware of the drama that had unfolded backstage, mourned the genius of Vanelli. While the musicians performed with a curious mixture of grief and relief, Richard Bennett offered no resistance. When formally arrested him, he maintained a composer's silence throughout the process, his face a mask of resigned dignity. Only when the batons were carefully packaged as evidence did he speak, his voice barely audible. "He killed my brother twice," he said, first his career, then his spirit. Thomas was the true genius. Later that evening, settled in Poirot's comfortable flat, we reflected on the case over glasses of hot chocolate. Miss Lemon had compiled a neat dossier of all the evidence for Japp's formal report. It was a murder composed with the precision of a symphony. Poirot mused, his eyes half closed as he saved his chocolate, each element. In its place, each development time to the measure. Bennett used his position to access Vincel's private room, his technical expertise to create the deadly mechanism, and his musical knowledge to determine the exact moment when Vanelli would grip the baton with sufficient force. But why keep the original batons? I wondered, surely that was an unnecessary risk. But there, you touch on the psychology of the crime. Manami Bennett did not see himself merely as a murderer, but as an instrument of justice. The batons were his trophies, proof that he had restored balance to the musical world that had destroyed his brother. Lady Harrington's antique baton provided the perfect opportunity. I realized he could examine its construction without suspicion. Precisely. And then create a replica incorporating his deadly mechanism. Poirot sighed gently, a tragedy of talent and revenge. Bennett's brilliance might have earned him the conductor's podium legitimately in time, but he could not wait for the music of justice to play out naturally. Miss Lemon closed her notebook with characteristic efficiency. "Will you be attending the trial?" "Mr. Poirot, I think not." Miss Lemon, "The evidence speaks clearly enough without my presence. Some final notes are better left unheard." He placed his empty cup on the side table. In this case, the music revealed the murderer, for as Bennett knew well and fatally forgot, every conductor must eventually answer to the score. The case of the conductor's baton was closed. The deadly symphony concluded. But in the quiet of Pooh's flat, I could almost hear the haunting echoes of Beethoven's Fifth, the sound of fate knocking at the door, and of justice finally answered. Thank you for tuning in to Cafe Stories. If you enjoyed the intrigue and suspense, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more captivating detective adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming and the mysteries alive.